Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be learning about spider monkeys at the zoo with Dr. Darby Proctor. I do want to mention a few announcements before we get started. So this is going to be our last public lecture for the semester. We'll be back in January. However, in the meantime, we have some exciting news. James Webb is going to be launching in December. And so after the talk today, you can find a link in the description leading to an Ask a Scientist session with some of our undergrad clubs, Student Astronomical Society, the Aries, and the Student for Space Exploration and Discovery. So today we have Dr. Darby Proctor from Florida Tech. And so, Dr. Proctor, please take it away.
Thanks. So I'm Dr. Darby Proctor. I'm associate professor in psychology here at Florida Tech. And just to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to do, I'll tell you a little bit about me. I couldn't resist throwing in a little bit about space and primates, since it seemed like all the other talks that are in this series had something to do with the space program. Then we'll get into talking about Brevard Zoo and the spider monkeys, which is really where I focus my research. So to get you a taste of who I am, this is me when I was little. I grew up in Germany. My dad was in the Air Force. And in fifth grade, my dad chaperoned a field trip to the zoo and in Frankfurt, and we went to this chimpanzee exhibit. It's in this photo here. And my dad was eating popcorn. And even though there were signs that said, "Do not feed the animals," in both German and English, my dad threw a piece of popcorn to this chimpanzee. And the chimp, it landed just outside of where the chimp could reach. So the chimp walked away, got a stick, came back, and used the stick to fish that piece of popcorn, and then ate the popcorn. And this blew my fifth grade mind. I was just completely in awe of how this animal would do this sort of thing. And so that's really what got me hooked on non-human primates. So it took me a while, but eventually I was an intern at Zoo Atlanta. I worked with their golden lion tamarin program. They did some free ranging with the lion tamarins because they were reintroducing them into the wild, which is one of the few successful reintroduction programs. The wild numbers of golden lion tamarins are doing much better now. I did some field work through the University of Cape Town. I studied how baboons were using their space, and especially how they were coming into conflict with humans, which is really cool, getting an opportunity to spend time in the field and see what primates do out in the wild. And eventually I decided I needed to get my PhD in something with primates. So I went to Georgia State University, where I focused on animal behavior and cognitive sciences through their School of Psychology. Then I went on to be a postdoc at Emory University in Yerkes National Primate Research Center. There I worked with chimpanzees, who were one of the coolest animals out there. And then after that postdoc, I came here to Florida Tech and started building this collaboration with Brevard Zoo that I'll be talking about tonight, and starting to work with the spider monkeys. So I wanted to begin by telling you a little bit about animal research and putting primate research into a bit of a context. One of the reasons that I'm interested in primates, and why other people are interested in primates, is because they're related to us. Well, we are a primate. So we are one of the great ape species, along with chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans. And so we're in the same evolutionary lineage as the rest of the primates, which means that we can look to the other primates to see where similarities and differences lie in terms of our cognition and our behavior. And so that can help us understand why humans evolved the way we did, what in our evolutionary history led us to develop certain traits and certain behaviors. And so looking at the other primates, again, can help us understand that a little bit better. So in terms of the primate lineage, there are four main branches, starting with the branch that includes humans, are the great apes. A little bit further spread out in evolutionary time are the old world monkeys. These are things like baboons, rhesus macaques. And then we go back in time more to new world monkeys. These are monkeys that live in Central and South America, things like capuchin monkeys. If you've seen the monkey Ross had on Friends, that's what he had. Or the monkey from the Night at the Museum movies, that's also a capuchin. And New World monkeys are where spider monkeys are. So keep that in mind as we go forward today. And then finally, the most distantly related group to the great apes are the prosimians. These are things like lemurs, but if you didn't know they were a primate, you probably wouldn't realize they were a primate. So they're a bit weird compared to the rest of the primate lineage. And so once again, we study this in psychology because psychology is the study of mind and behavior. And so we aren't limited just to human minds. We also study non-humans so that we can learn again about that evolutionary trajectory. And so since this is a talk to a group that studies space, I thought I would go a bit outside of my comfort zone and tell you a little bit about the history of primates in the space program. So the first primate to ever make it to space was Albert the First. He launched on a V2 rocket in 1948, but unfortunately he died of suffocation before landing on back on Earth. But he was the first primate that ever went into space. Then they had Alberts 2 through 6. They also did not survive their trip to space. They either died before landing or on impact. There were a few parachutes that didn't open. And then in one case, the monkey made it back to Earth, but then suffocated died from heat stroke before they were able to get him out of the capsule. So the early history of primates in space is not that great. You don't want to be a primate that a non-human primate that NASA or the Air Force uses. But in the late 50s, 1959, Abel and Baker were the first primates to survive a trip to space. Abel was a rhesus macaque, you can see him on the left, and Baker was a squirrel monkey. And these two went to space and made it back. Abel unfortunately died a few days later. He had some complications from a surgery, so he didn't have a long life. But Baker survived and lived to be about 27. And she's actually buried at the Air and Space Museum in Huntsville, Alabama. And she has a grave site there, and visitors apparently sometimes leave bananas on her grave. And both of these monkeys launched right here from the Cape. So we're a little bit tied to the history of primates in space. Then we get to the first great ape that went to space, which was Ham the astrochimp. And so he was part of the space program in the 1960s. He went to space and he survived, and he came back down to Earth and lived again a fairly long life after returning. But he was the first primate to actually do something in space. So they had trained him to pull levers and do a variety of tasks for food rewards for banana flavored pellets. And that was the first proof of concept that humans could actually go to space and do something in space. And apparently Ham's performance was only a couple seconds slower in space than it was here on Earth. And so this paved the way for Alan Shepard's flight to space later that year. So primates were really instrumental in the history of getting humans off the planet. So now I'm gonna really awkwardly transition and stop pretending that I know anything about space, because now we're gonna switch gears and talk about the stuff that I'm really involved in here at Florida Tech. So most of my career I spent working in primate research labs. These are places we have primates in under human care, and they're dedicated research spaces. But due to funding and sort of the reality of running primate labs, these labs are closing all over the country. And so I really think that the future of animal behavior research is in zoos instead of dedicated research centers. So I wanted to make that jump from labs to zoos. And Florida Tech and Brevard Zoo seemed a great place to do that, partially because Florida Tech is one of only 12 places in the country where undergrads can earn a degree or concentration in animal behavior and cognition. So as part of our psychology program, animal behavior and cognition is one of our concentrations that students can get involved in. And so this seemed like a great place to try and make that transition. And I knew that you could make that transition because of some of the work that happened at Zoo Atlanta in collaboration with Yerkes National Primate Research Center. A researcher there, Rob Hampton, does work with rhesus macaques in a primate research center. And he also, at Zoo Atlanta, got them to install what they call their learning tree. This is a tree that's it's in the orangutan habitat at the zoo. And so the orangutans can go out and play computer games for the scientists whenever they feel like it. So here's a video. You can see the orangutan using the learning tree on the left and the rhesus macaque in a primate research center doing actually the same task on the right side of the screen. So this was sort of the proof of concept that we could do the same types of research in research labs that we can do we can do the same types of research in zoos that we could do in research labs as well. So when I came here, there really wasn't too much of a relationship between Florida Tech and Brevard Zoo. They'd collaborated on some small scale things in the past, but I was really brought in to help grow this collaboration and really deepen our ties. And now I think both the zoo and Florida Tech view this as an essential collaboration. I wouldn't be able to do my research without the zoo, and we give back to the zoo by helping them do some of their own research. Now, before I get too far into this and start talking about the research that I do, I wanted to point out that research is cognitive enrichment for the animals. And so the types of tasks that we do, I think the primates view it as the silly games humans want to play with us. All of our testing is voluntary. We basically call the animals by name, and if they want to come over and participate in research, they can. But if they don't want to, that's fine. We'll try again another day. And it's not like you can make a monkey do anything anyway. They can be quite stubborn. So what we're doing at the zoo while we're getting knowledge for science, we're actually also improving the lives of those animals by keeping their psychological wellness high, by giving them the types, or at least we're giving them games and puzzles that would make them use the same types of cognitive abilities that they would be using in the wild, even though it's in very different form. And so we think that promotes their psychological wellness. And from an anecdotal standpoint, my biggest problem is that too many monkeys want to participate in my research at once. And so that shows me that they're really excited about the research and really enjoy participating. So Brevard Zoo is pretty forward-looking, and they recently went through a big renovation of one of their areas called Rainforest Revealed. And as part of that, they wanted to make science part of the zoo experience because it can be enrichment for animals, it can be education for the public that's going to visit the zoo, but it also provides us with knowledge as scientists. And there were a couple of zoos that were already doing something like this, such as Zoo Atlanta, Lincoln Park Zoo, San Diego Zoo. So some really big name zoos were doing this. And so when the zoo wanted to start thinking about this new expansion, Rainforest Revealed, they wanted to see how they could incorporate science even more into the visitor experience. And again, also enriching the lives of the animals and providing great scientific data for me. So Rainforest Revealed, it was previously known as La Salva. It's their South American loop, if you've been to the zoo. And they rebranded it Rainforest Revealed. It still has animals from Central and South America in it. And the whole thing is just phenomenal. I think it's by far the coolest part of the zoo. There's everything from venomous snakes to giant river otters. But of course, my favorite part that we'll zoom in a little bit on is the spider monkey area. And so in the spider monkey area, we wanted to give the monkeys as much choice and control over their everyday lives as possible so that, again, their psychological well-being could be high. And so the spider monkeys used to have one habitat, and we expanded that to be 3 habitats that are all interconnected by overhead sky bridges or overhead tunnels. So the monkeys can choose when and where to go and when and where to spend their time, which lets them choose who they want to hang out with and gives them a whole lot of freedom. This also mimics a little bit how they live in the wild, where they sometimes split up into small subgroups away from the rest of their group. But we'll talk about that more in a minute. So they have these three areas. We can see a lot of naturalistic behaviors that they can, again, spend where to choose their time. But what I'm also really excited about is our new Cognitive Research Center. This is also connected to the spider monkey habitats by overhead bridges. And in this space, we can call monkeys, again, we call them by name, we ask them to come in and work with us, and we can work with them one-on-one so that we can have a lot more control about how we work with the animals. And this is the first place in the world that I know of that has a dedicated research space for spider monkeys. So we are here at the forefront of spider monkey research. And so this partnership between Florida Tech and Brevard Zoo is going to be really instrumental in learning about these monkeys, because we don't know all that much about spider monkeys. In terms of New World monkeys, we know a whole lot about capuchin monkeys and a few other species, but spider monkeys have been relatively understudied. They live in dense rainforests in Central and South America, and they live right up at the top of the trees. So spider monkeys generally are a bit more widespread, but I study Ateles jeffreyi, which is the specific species of spider monkey that they have at the zoo. And so their natural habitat is really throughout Central America. Now, these monkeys, they live in tropical forests in the upper levels of the rainforest canopy, so about 25 to 30 meters high. And they prefer to live in undisturbed primary forest. That means that this forest has existed for a really long time, and it hasn't been disturbed by humans, which of course is becoming harder and harder due to human activities. And so spider monkeys are at risk of extinction. They're classified as endangered. They're threatened by habitat loss, forest degradation, bushmeat hunting, so people hunting them for meat, as well as the illegal pet trade, which we'll come back to towards the end of the talk. Spider monkeys got their name because if you look at a spider monkey hanging around in the forest, apparently it looks a bit like a spider. They have these really long prehensile tails, which means that they can grasp with their tails. And so it essentially becomes a fifth limb for them. And so I guess someone back in the day looked up and thought they looked kind of like giant spiders. And so that's where they got their name. They primarily eat leaves and fruit, but occasionally they'll also eat things like flowers and other sorts of insects. Spider monkeys can live up to about 25 years in the wild. When they're under human care in settings like at a zoo, they can live into their 30s and sometimes even under their 40s. This is a picture of one of the monkeys two of the monkeys at Brevard Zoo, Shelly with her daughter Olive. Shelly just had her 30th birthday and she gave birth to Olive in 2020, so when she was 29. So Olive's about a year and a half old now, and Shelly's about 30. Spider monkeys have a really slow reproductive rate, which is a challenge for their conservation efforts. A slow reproductive rate means that they typically give birth to one infant every 4 or so years. So if something happens to that infant, it represents a really big investment loss in terms of the parents. The gestation period for spider monkeys is about 7.5 months. So fairly similar to humans. And again, they have a really extended life history. So it takes them a long time to develop. They're dependent on their mom for at least the first 4 years, if not a little bit longer, of their life. Now, if you go to the zoo and you look at our spider monkeys, I need to tell you a little bit about their genitals. If you think it's a male, because there's something long and pink and dangling, it's actually a female. That is their clitoris. So it's really easy to figure out who's a male and who's a female by that long dangling clitoris. And so it's pretty easy to identify each one of the sexes. So why am I so interested in spider monkeys? Part of it is because they're understudied, but the other part of it is because they share really interesting behavioral similarities with both humans and chimpanzees. And one of the primary ways that they primary similarities that they have is in terms of their social system. So they live in what's called a fission-fusion social system. And that means they have a big social group and they break off into these small subgroups for days or sometimes even weeks at a time. Now that's really interesting because it's, again, just like us, we have friends, but we might not see them all the time, which means that us and chimpanzees and spider monkeys have to manage our social relationships across space and time. And that implies a high degree of cognitive ability because you have to remember things, you have to individually identify each animal that you have a relationship with. There's all these cognitive components of having this fission-fusion social system. And so I think that spider monkeys are going to have really complex cognitive abilities, but we haven't really studied those because most of the work that's been done with spider monkeys has been done in the wild, and you just can't see all of their cognitive abilities, and you can't, more importantly, test their cognitive abilities. What you can learn from animals in the wild is what do these animals do? But if you have them in something like a zoo where you can do research with them, you can figure out what the limits of their abilities are. So what can they do, even if we don't necessarily see that behavior in the wild? So to give you an idea of how complicated these monkeys are in terms of their social relationships, these are a few social network analysis diagrams. Now, you don't have to pay attention to anything about this except that the number of dots is the number of individuals, and the more lines there are, the more different relationships are occurring. So you can see with the top left figure, that's a squirrel monkey, Cimeri, and they don't have very many other individuals that they interact with, and they don't have a whole lot of lines going between them. So they don't have very complex social dynamics. If you compare that to humans or chimps, pan-troglodytes, you can see that there's a lot more dots, a lot more interconnecting lines. And then the bottom left is a spider monkey social network analysis, and you can see it's pretty complex. It looks, about as complex as chimpanzees, probably not as complex as humans, but again, this type of social complexity is implying these high levels of cognitive abilities. So I keep using this word cognition, and I just wanted to define it. So broadly speaking, cognition is all the ways animals take in information through their senses, process, retain, and decide how to act upon their that information that they've received from the environment. So basically, it's things like how animals learn, how they make decisions, how they behave in different contexts. That's the type of stuff that is really interesting to me to study. So let me give you an example of some primate cognition in action. So these are actually capuchin monkeys. This is a study that I really like by Brasna and DeWall, and it's a very simple experiment that they did. They first give a capuchin monkey a rock, and that monkey hands the rock back and gets a piece of cucumber. And they'll do this all day for cucumber. They really like doing this task, and they're happy to do it for quite some time. But now the key experimental manipulation is this first monkey gets a cucumber, just like they've been having, but now the partner monkey is going to get a grape. And to capuchin monkeys, grapes are way better than cucumbers. So the partner got a grape. Now we go back to Lance, and she's going to get her cucumber again, which, remember, she just ate. So now all of a sudden, this cucumber is no good, and she actually throws it back at the experimenter. You can see her shaking the cage. You don't have to be a primate expert to know that this is not a very happy monkey. So one more time, see what she does. We'll hand back the rock, takes her a little bit longer. Give her that piece of cucumber, and once again, this cucumber is now just worthless to her. So what's going on here is that Lance is actually comparing her outcomes with the outcomes of another. for doing the same amount of effort. And so what Lance is exhibiting is what we call inequity aversion. Inequity aversion simply means that when someone gets paid more than you for doing the same amount of work, you don't like it, just like we have in humans, right? And we get a sense that the animals are saying something akin to that's not fair, because they're objecting behaviorally, they're objecting to getting this lower valued payment. Now, we think that inequity aversion is present in animals that cooperate. So, so animals that cooperate would need a sense of inequity aversion, because you shouldn't cooperate with someone unless you're getting something out of it. In fact, you shouldn't cooperate with someone unless you're getting more than what you could do working on your own. And so we think inequity aversion evolved with cooperation as a mechanism for preventing cheating, essentially, in cooperative type situations. So we know that some of the primates, at least, are highly cooperative. So humans, we're the most cooperative species ever. Chimpanzees are also really cooperative. Here in this picture, 3 of them are cooperating. They're doing the same task at the same time so that they can all access a food reward. And we also see high levels of cooperation in capuchin monkeys. And this is a pretty good diagram to illustrate to you what we call the bar pull task. The bar pull task is when you have a tray that has food rewards on it, but it's weighted so heavily on the backside that one monkey isn't strong enough to pull it in on its own. So they have to work together or else they can't retrieve the food reward. And so we see species that cooperate in the wild able to solve this bar pull task when they're under human care. So here's a video of this being done with squirrel monkeys, which are, again, another New World monkey species. And this video is courtesy of Dr. Kate Talbot, who actually recently joined Florida Tech to help bolster our animal behavior program. So she was doing work with squirrel monkeys to try and see if they could solve this cooperation task, but they don't cooperate in the wild. We don't see them having high levels of cooperation. In fact, we see very little cooperation with them. And so what you see is she gave them the ends of the bar pull. In this case, it's this plastic chain. And what you see is that one monkey just continuing to pull even though nothing is happening. Finally, they get their act together and pull together, but this was a trained behavior. It took Dr. Talbot 8 months to get them trained to do this task, but they never seemed to grasp some key components of the task, like not to pull the bar in unless your partner is also pulling on the bar. And so when we look at these cooperative species, we see chimpanzees and capuchin monkeys who cooperate a lot in the wild. They also cooperate in experimental contexts, whereas squirrel monkeys, we don't see them cooperating in the wild, and they also sort of fail our cooperation tasks when we work with them experimentally. Now, spider monkeys, we don't see the same levels of cooperation in the wild that we see with chimpanzees and capuchin monkeys, but there's always a question there. And that is there something about their environment that makes it so that they don't have to cooperate, but they're capable of it? Or are they not capable of it, and so we don't see them cooperating? So we decided here to run a cooperation task, to run this same type of bar pull task. This was pre-COVID, so you won't see us wearing masks. But basically, this is the same apparatus. There's 2 ends, and those ends are attached to ropes, which we give to the monkeys. So here you'll see one of my students. She's baiting the trays. So she's putting a food reward on each side. And you can see that immediately the spider monkeys synchronize their pulling and pull that in so that they can both get the bar pull reward. Now, you might not know it, but spider monkeys are pretty strong. We had to use about 20 pounds of weight so that one of them couldn't pull it in alone. We did this the very first day we tried this. They figured it out in about 5 minutes, which is really, really fast. And then they were very good at cooperating. So what we see is that spider monkeys, we don't see them cooperating in the wild, but they can do it in experimental contexts. So that gives us a clue that some of this social complexity might lead to them having abilities that we're not seeing them demonstrate in the wild, making them a really interesting species to study experimentally. So that's just an example of one of the types of research that we do with the spider monkeys. We also are working on a task to look at their planning and decision-making abilities. This is what we call the paddle box task. This is kind of like a pachinko machine where a food reward is placed on one of these U-shaped paddles, and then the monkey has to turn the paddle and get the food reward to fall into a certain location. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to access that food reward. So in this figure, if we put the food in location 1, the monkey could turn that to the left and get in spot A, but they can't access the food reward. So they have to learn to turn it to the right where they can access that food reward. And of course, we counterbalance that so that sometimes they turn it to the right, sometimes they turn it to the left. So here's a very bad video that I quickly shot to try and illustrate this. So we're still in the first phase of this. We're putting a peanut into the first level of a paddle. And what you can see is that the monkey initially turns it towards the right, where they can't access the food reward, and quickly turns it back to the left, where they can see it. That was a little quick, so let me show it to you again. See that little bobble to the right, then the monkey turns it to the left where she can access that food reward. So again, that's an example of some of the types of testing that we're doing at Brevard Zoo right now. Now, one thing we want to get to is doing computerized testing. This is a method that's used really frequently in primate research labs. So this monkey, again, courtesy of Rob Hampton, this video, is doing what we call an oddity task. He's touching a green square to start it. Then he touches the stimuli, which is a face of another monkey. And then he picks which picture is not of that same monkey. And of course, the pictures are all from a different perspective. So we can test things like individual recognition, memory, all sorts of things we can do with computerized testing. And so we're working on getting that up and running with our spider monkeys. But I'm not a computer programmer, so it's taking us a little bit of time to get our systems up and running. But here's an example of one of our monkeys. She was interacting with a touchscreen with a training program. All she had to do was touch that big red dot and she would get a reward. But the spider monkey did something completely unexpected to me, and she started using her tail to interact with the touchscreen. One thing I forgot to mention about spider monkeys is that they don't have thumbs. And that's really weird. Primates are known for having thumbs, but over evolutionary time, spider monkeys have lost their thumbs. But they have these really cool prehensile tails, and they use them for interacting with the world like we would use a hand with a thumb, like here interacting with a touchscreen computer. So this has got me thinking about this idea of tail cognition. What can these animals do with their tails? And if you look closely in this picture, you can see that underneath the tail, there's actually a pad of skin that is the same sort of skin that's on our fingertips. So you can grasp things really well with it. They can grasp the tiniest little things with their tails. And so one of the areas that I'm currently researching is whether sort of to explore this idea that maybe they lost their thumbs, but this tail became a sort of replacement for their thumbs. Now, we're very lucky to have this partnership with Brevard Zoo. None of the research I do would be possible without our relationship. And part of that relationship means giving back to the zoo. So we also help the zoo when they have issues with with their animals. And so sometimes they'll think, oh, this animal might be stressed. Could we, could me and my team do some behavioral observations so that we can see if there's something in the environment that needs to change. So for example, a few years ago, they built a new jaguar exhibit, and we tracked the jaguars as they first got access to that exhibit to see things like where the jaguars were spending a lot of time, what areas of the habitat were they ignoring. And based on the data that me and my undergraduate students collected, we were able to get the zoo to implement some changes in the exhibit. Some areas, again, were overused. We put some more enrichment, some more climbing structures on that, and helped the jaguars to use their space more effectively. And so this is a great chance for undergraduate students to get involved in the research we do, because it's very safe, because you're just doing behavioral observations. I shouldn't say just doing behavioral observations. They're actually quite challenging to learn how to do. But it's a great chance for undergraduates to collect data and see pretty quickly how we can use that data and make the lives of these animals better. So that's, sort of a quick overview of the types of research that I do at the zoo, and why spider monkeys are a cool and interesting animal to do research with. But sometimes working in a zoo, you get to do things that are somewhat unexpected. So I want to tell you a little bit about a monkey named Mateo. In 2020, in the summer of 2020, Customs and Border Protection found Mateo being smuggled into the country from Mexico into Texas. This is a picture of him when Customs and Border Protection found him. This is actually in the console of a pickup truck. And so you can see just how tiny he was at this point. And so, as I said, spider monkeys are an endangered species. It is not legal to transport them into the US without lots and lots and lots of permitting. And so why was someone trying to smuggle this little guy into the country? Well, unfortunately, it was part of the illegal pet trade. And the illegal pet trade is a huge problem around the world for endangered animals, but also for spider monkeys in particular. So when Customs and Border Protection found him, we think he was about 3 months old. And so the way animals get into the illegal pet trade is that often poachers will go into the forests, they'll shoot the mom, kill the mother, and take the infant, because that's the only way they're going to get an infant away from a mother. And I sort of hate to show you this next picture, but I also think it's important. But this is what some of the illegal pet trade looks like. These are all infant monkeys. This is actually a photo from Asia. These are all infant rhesus macaques that have been, essentially their mothers have been killed and they've been brought into the illegal pet trade. And the illegal pet trade is unfortunately the fourth most profitable illegal industry behind guns, drugs, and human trafficking. So this is a huge issue, a huge worldwide issue that is having really bad outcomes for endangered animals in particular. So, unfortunately, this poor little guy came from a very, very tragic backstory. And this happened during the summer of 2021, or sorry, of 2020, when COVID, of course, was going strong. And so this little guy had to be sent to an extended quarantine through the CDC. And so he ended up being in quarantine for about 3 months. So if you do the math, he was taken away from his family by the time he was 3 months old. Then he spent 3 more months in quarantine. So that meant that for half of his life, he hadn't been around other monkeys, which is really not good for monkeys. It's terrible for their social development and their cognitive development. They need to be with other members of their species because they are so socially complex. And so this little guy, Mateo, he needed someplace to go. And there's what we call species survival plans, or SSPs. These are places that take care of all the animals that are under human care and essentially play genetic match.com around zoos. And so the SSP was looking for a home for this little guy, and we thought the Brevard Zoo would be a great place because we had another monkey, Shelly, who had an infant, Olive, about the same age as Mateo. And so we were hoping that Shelly might adopt Mateo. But there was a big problem, and that problem was there was no way for us to physically get Mateo from Texas to Florida because zoos typically rely on commercial airlines for transporting animals, but no one would fly a non-human primate during a time of COVID because they're potential carriers of COVID. They can get COVID just like we can. And so no one would fly him. So I had a thought that was to see if our colleagues at FIT Aviation would be able to help us out. You know, Florida Tech has planes, they have pilots. And so we got together. I got my dean at the time, Lisa Steelman, involved. She got us in touch with Florida Tech Aviation, and we were able to set up a sort of rescue mission for this little monkey. So two of our Florida Tech pilots, as well as Dave Quillian, who is the curator at the zoo, flew to Texas, having to make several refueling stops along the way to pick up Mateo to bring him back to the zoo. So this is Mateo the afternoon that he arrived at the zoo. He was very tired, but he looked like he was in okay shape, but his legs were a little malformed because he hadn't been getting the amount of exercise that he should have been getting because he was in this quarantine facility for so long. And we quickly came to realize that Mateo had no idea that he was a monkey. In fact, he was extremely afraid of all of our monkeys, probably because he hadn't seen another monkey for over half of his short life. So we slowly started introducing him to our monkeys, and we had hoped that Shelley would adopt him. But it turns out Shelley was such a good mom that she wouldn't let her current infant Olive get anywhere near this stranger monkey. So we introduced him to some of our juvenile monkeys, and he started making some friends. And we were hesitant or perhaps a little nervous about putting him with males because male primates can engage in what's called infanticide, where they kill infants. And they do this as a mating strategy to make the moms come back into estrus sooner so they can have their own offspring. But we were a bit worried about what would happen when we introduced the males, our adult male, to this little infant who didn't have a mom to protect him. Well, it turns out that Shooter, our alpha male, was incredibly good with Mateo. The first time that they came together, they were together in a habitat. Shooter would sit down near Mateo, not too close to him, but near him, hold out his hand and wait for Mateo to come take his hand. And very quickly, these two developed a really special relationship. And when we look at our behavioral data that we have on these monkeys, Mateo is actually spending more time with Shooter than Olive is with Shelley, her mom. And so to us, this looks like in every meaningful way, Shooter has adopted Mateo. Shooter will wait for Mateo. He makes sure Mateo is with the rest of the group. If there's a fight involving Mateo, Shooter defends him, even against his own offspring. And so they've really developed this very special relationship that was so unexpected, but also such a joy to get to see what these animals are capable of. And today, about a year after he arrived, Mateo now is a member of the spider monkey family. If you didn't know that he was an orphan monkey, you wouldn't be able to tell just by watching the monkeys because he's such an integrated part of their social group now. So that was the one good thing to come out of 2020 for us, was getting to introduce Mateo to his new family. And more recently, this September, this happened again. So this is Jay, who is another infant spider monkey who is confiscated at the Texas-Mexico border. This time, someone figured out that they were about to get pulled over in their car search. So they did a U-turn and threw a suitcase out the window. 18 hours later, Customs and Border Protection found the suitcase and found Jay inside, and he was remarkably still alive. So once again, he's been sent to Brevard Zoo, and now we're working to integrate him into our spider monkey group. Him and Mateo have become really great friends, and we're working to continue integrating him with the rest of the monkeys. And we have to do that at the monkey's pace. So sometimes it takes a bit of time to get them integrated, but hopefully by next year we'll have another fully integrated infant spider monkey in our troop here at Brevard Zoo. And so, again, none of this would be possible without this great partnership between Florida Tech and the zoo. So I'm going to wrap up there. I want to just acknowledge a few people. Emily Almodovar Warner, I used a bunch of her pictures that she took. Kate Talbot, who's my partner in research crime at Florida Tech. And of course, Brevard Zoo and the staff there for taking care of the monkeys and letting me do my research. So I would be happy to take some questions from you all.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm giving you a applause on behalf of all of our audience. That was a really great talk. I actually got a little emotional when you were talking about Mateo and Shooter and their special bond.
Yeah,
That's a nice thing to really come out of the last couple of years. So thank you again for a great talk. So we have
no,
a few
my pleasure.
questions, all coming from Dr. Ryusei. And so the first kind of set of questions is kind of um, asking about the differences between monkey, ape, lemur, and primate. Kind of, if you can
Sure.
kind of go over that again.
Yeah, sure. So primates are the branch of animals, um, and within primates, all of those different groups, monkeys, lemurs, and apes, are all primates. So the difference between a monkey and an ape, at least the easy way to tell the difference between a monkey and an ape, is that apes don't have tails. So we don't have tails, chimpanzees don't have tails, gorillas, orangutans don't have tails. So those are all of the apes. And so apes are different from monkeys, not just because they don't have a tail, but because they have much bigger brains, so are much more cognitively complex typically than monkeys. Monkeys are sort of the next group, next most distantly related from humans. So it goes apes because we're classified as an ape. Then the monkeys. Monkeys have tails. They don't have quite as big of a brains. They're not as cognitively complex. And then we get to the final branch of the primates, which is the lemurs. Well, it's prosimians, so things like lemurs and the aye, which is a really crazy animal. If you don't know what an aye is, Google it. Aye. They look sort of like a vampire cat thing.
They have really
Um,
big eyes, right? Like,
yeah, huge eyes, and a finger that actually has a 360-degree ball socket in it, so they can turn their middle finger all the way around to hunt for grubs. They're really creepy and cool at the same time, and so those are the most distantly related from humans in terms of the groups of primates.
all right. So do most species of monkeys present similarities with human behaviors like spider monkeys, or are the spider monkeys kind of the rule rather than the exception?
Yeah, so we're all primates, so that means we do share some characteristics in common, so some traits. The primates are social. Primates, other than spider monkeys, have thumbs. They tend not to do well alone, and so to a certain degree, all of the primates have some things in common, but there are species that have more in common than others. So spider monkeys are an example of one of those that have some of those unique or more rare features in the primate lineage that are shared with humans. Spider monkeys and capuchin monkeys, who are somewhat closely related, they're both New World monkeys, also have really large brain sizes compared to the rest of the New World monkeys. And humans, of course, have the largest brain size to body ratio of any animal. And sort of a rough rule of thumb is that the larger your brain to body size ratio, the more cognitively complex you are. And so there's sort of physiological and neuroanatomical reasons that we would suspect that things like spider monkeys and capuchins and humans and chimpanzees would show some similar types of cognitive abilities.
Okay. We have a comment that from Brian Murphy saying, "Glad Mateo has a new friend." Um,
Yes, we are
and
glad Jay has a new friend too.
yeah. And then from Dr. Dan Bachelor, who was our previous speaker, we have a question. How do you anticipate the adolescent development of adopted monkeys into a larger group? Would they be at a social disadvantage for finding a mate, for example?
Yes, so we it would not surprise us at all to see that Mateo or Jay had some deficits in social skills. We know that young infants, if they're taken away from their mothers, they tend not to develop along the same cognitive trajectory as peers that were raised with their mothers. And that does lead down the line to them having problems finding mates. And having sort of normal, typical adult social behaviors. And so we wouldn't be surprised if these sort of traumatic life histories would lead them to have some sort of social deficits. And at first, I thought Mateo was going to definitely have some social deficits because he was a bit of a drama queen, for lack of a better phrase. If someone would look at him wrong, he would just start screaming. But he's sort of gotten out of that phase and seems much more integrated. And so the other thing that's really impressed me about Mateo is just how resilient these animals can be. And so now I'm hopeful that even if he has some social deficits as an adult, they'll be relatively minor. But of course, we have to wait and see in his case. But there is quite a bit of body of research on that. That yeah, it's quite likely we'll see some degree of social deficits.
Uh, to kind of follow up on that, when would they kind of reach the adolescent age that you might start seeing this?
Yeah, so we really consider them infants until they're about 2, and then from 2 to 6 they would be adolescents, and 6 to maybe 10 they'd be sort of subadults, and then they'd be full adults. So it probably wouldn't be until they got into the subadult or adult phase that we would really know if they have some social deficits, because infants and juveniles, they can get away with a little bit more. The monkeys seem to recognize that they're younger, and so don't hold them to the same social standards that they hold other adults to. And so it will probably be a number of years before we would see whether or not Mateo or Jay has any problems being an adult.
Okay. Next question is from Brian Murphy. Do species within certain areas of the world show higher cognition levels than others, and vice versa? For example, do primates in isolated regions socially stagnate, so like in islands or Madagascar, for
Yeah.
example?
So Madagascar is a really cool place for primates. That's where a lot of the prosimians live. So the critters that are most distantly related to humans in the primate lineage. And being on an island, they just went sort of crazy with evolution and went into some really weird things that we don't see in any other branches of the primates or any other areas of the world besides Madagascar. But to get to the bigger question about sort of cognition and the region of the world you're in, not really. So the smartest are the great apes, chimpanzees, bonobos from Africa, orangutans from Southeast Asia, gorillas, I guess, also from Africa. So I guess Africa is maybe a hotbed, but that's primarily where the apes came from. Um, but I think it has more to do with their evolutionary branch than the actual geographic location. So, for example, a baboon in Africa is going to be about as smart as a rhesus macaque in Southeast Asia. Um, in terms of the great apes, chimpanzees are really awesome and smart, but their first strategy for solving any problem is to hit it. Whereas orangutans are a bit more patient and clever, and from Southeast Asia rather than Africa. So it's not necessarily region of the world, I would say, more about their evolutionary history and their current environment.
All right. Well, if anybody has any more questions, please add them to the chat. I'm going to take this opportunity to ask my questions since we don't have any new ones. Well, first I'm going to make an observation is that if we're going to send any more monkeys to space, we should not name them Albert. I think that's the takeaway.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think so too. Yeah, the Alberts did not fare well at all.
Um, So you mentioned that the spider monkeys, their habitat is Central America and this kind of rainforest environment and things like that. How does Florida kind of compare them being in the kind of Florida environment with their natural habitat?
Yeah, it's not too bad. So where we live in a nice, hot, humid place, which is just like a rainforest, we do have a little bit more temperature variation. So it does get a little bit cooler here than it would get in their, well, we have cooler seasons than they would have, but because they're from the tropics, essentially, they would have around 12 hours of daylight, year round. So nights do get cool there. So it's actually a pretty great climate for them here. We did a study a number of years ago where we were observing them overnight for various reasons, and they turns out they hung out outside most of the time, didn't even go in their night house to sleep. So it seems like the weather here is really good for them.
Okay. So you were mentioning doing some of these different cognition tests with the spider monkeys. Um, is Are some of those reactions of theirs like learned skills? And if so, like basically like, or did they just, I know you kind of mentioned that they pretty much seem to pick up a lot of those really quickly, especially like with the turning of the knob to get the food, like the spider monkey was able to figure it out before they dropped the food, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
is there some way to kind of test how they compared like when you were doing this more regularly than having the like the COVID gap and to now?
Yeah. Yeah, so certainly some of the projects we were sort of in the middle of, we'll have to restart, just because we don't. Their memory hasn't been tested very much, because there aren't that many places doing cognitive research with them. Their memory is great, like that's the real answer, but we don't have the scientific evidence of that yet. And so we will have to restart some of our experiments. So the planning task where they were turning the paddles, they actually kept outsmarting my apparatus. So I have to restart that project because they learned how to cheat. They outsmarted me, I guess. Um, so some things are learned, and that's okay, right, in terms of our testing, because we want to see their learning process. Other things we want to see how they occur more naturally. And so things that we want to see, that whether or not they sort of have it, we test fewer trials than things we want them to learn to be able to do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. I just kind of seeing if like maybe taking the opportunity to kind of make use of the gap due to COVID. Yeah.
Yeah, so one thing that we're going to do a study on is, because of course there were no visitors at the zoo for a while during COVID, and so we want to look at we were still able to keep some behavioral observations up and running during COVID, and so we want to compare their sort of behavior during that COVID break when no visitors were at the zoo compared to before and after when they had their more normal levels of visitors being around, because I suspect that affects them. In my very subjective, non-scientific view, it seemed like they were kind of happy when the visitors came back. They started being more active and interacting with guests at the zoo. Um, so I think we'll see some differences there.
Okay. So if we're gonna visit the zoo, when would you recommend we go to have the best opportunity to see the spider
Yes.
monkeys doing their thing?
Yes, so they will be out all the time. Earlier in the morning is typically better than the afternoon. They like to take a nice long nap in the afternoon. So usually, if I'm going to go see the monkeys and they're going to be up doing stuff, usually sometime between 9:30 and 11 is the great time to see them.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dr. Proctor, and we got a comment for a nice talk and thanking you and some applause from some of the audience members. So,
Thank
giving
you.
you a virtual round of applause. Um,
Thanks. It was
and
my pleasure.
yeah, typically we do space stuff, but it's public science, and so this was really interesting and definitely um, glad that you were able to join us and you did such a fantastic job. So,
Thank you.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone. For those of you still with us, Aries, SAS, and SEDS have a virtual space that you guys can convene. and talk about hopefully the upcoming James Webb talk and some of the research that's going on at Florida Tech. It's mostly space-based things, but yeah. Thank you again, Dr. Proctor, and thank you all. And we will be back in January. So have a good night, everyone.
Night.